The sky bled violet as Garrick crouched in the underbrush, his knife gleaming in his grip. His breath was steady, his muscles coiled, his mind honed to the single objective, survival. He had tracked the creature for over an hour, following the faint luminescent trails it left behind, an iridescent shimmer against the damp jungle floor. Whatever it was fast, silent, a predator that didn't know it was being hunted. Then he saw it. A flash of movement, too elegant, too deliberate to be just another beast of this forsaken world. The glow of its skin pulsed like distant starlight. Its form was humanoid but too lithe, too unearthly. Garrick had learned long ago that humanoid didn't mean harmless. He tensed his grip on the knife, stepping lightly, carefully, drawing closer. He moved with precision, his footfalls swallowed by the dense vegetation. His breath barely stirred the humid air. Then action. His body launched forward, the knife cutting a sure arc toward the creature's throat. He expected resistance, a snarl, an instinctual fight. Instead, the moment his blade bit into flesh, the figure collapsed with a gasp, not a scream. A gasp. The glow dimmed as the creature. No, the girl fell onto her back. His first thought was that it had to be a trick. A deceptive display, some unknown biology playing possum to lure him in. But then her lips parted and she spoke. "Why did you hurt me?" The words weren't just sound. They were laced with something else, something that cracked through his certainty. Garrick's knife remained poised, his instincts screaming at him to finish the job. But his body hesitated. No creature begged for understanding as it died. Not like this. She shifted slightly, her hand pressing to the wound at her shoulder, violet blood shimmering in the dim light. Her face was sharp yet delicate, her silver eyes too large, too knowing. Strands of liquid blue hair clung to her damp skin. She was watching him with something closer to sadness than fear. His voice was rough, uncertain. "You're not human." A flicker of light traced across her skin, a response he couldn't interpret. "Neither are you." She had no weapon. No claws, no fangs. His strike had been meant for a beast, but what lay before him was something else entirely. He took a step back. His mind clawed at every practical justification to end this encounter before it complicated things further. She should be dead. He should be moving on, securing food, ensuring his survival for another day. And yet, her hand twitched toward him, barely an inch, before curling into a fist. "I won't beg," she murmured. "If you mean to finish it, do it now." Garrick didn't move. The jungle was silent except for the steady rhythm of his own pulse. The wound was shallow, deliberate. He had aimed to disable, not to kill outright. A precaution, not an execution, a choice. Something in him twisted at the thought. "You'll bleed out before the hour's done," he said, not sure why he was talking instead of walking away. Her gaze didn't waver. "Then leave." He should. Instead, he crouched beside her, digging into the small pack at his hip. He pulled out a strip of cloth, roughly torn from an old undershirt. She flinched when he reached for her, but didn't resist as he pressed the fabric against the wound. Her skin was warm beneath his touch, pulsing with that strange inner light. "I don't know why I'm doing this," he muttered. She exhaled, something like relief crossing her features. "Neither do I." Garrick tied the cloth around her wound with quick, efficient movements, ignoring the way her skin thrummed under his fingers. It wasn't human warmth. It was something else, something alive in a way he didn't understand. The glow pulsed in time with her breath, shifting between shades of deep violet and soft gold. She watched him with those silver eyes, wary but not afraid. That unsettled him more than anything. She should be terrified, should be running, fighting back something. Instead, she was just waiting. "What are you?" he asked, his voice quieter than he meant it to be. Her lips parted as if she might answer, but then her gaze flicked past him, her expression sharpening. A sound in the distance, faint but unmistakable. A low hum like machinery stirring the air. Raiders. Garrick's jaw clenched. He knew that sound too well. Slavers, scavengers, hunters. It didn't matter what they called themselves. They took what they wanted, left nothing but bones behind. She must have recognized the shift in his posture because she tensed, her fingers digging into the dirt. "More of you." "Not mine," he said shortly. He rose to his feet, scanning the trees. He had maybe minutes before they were too close. The girl moved, pushing herself up with a sharp inhale. She swayed slightly but steadied herself, her breathing controlled. "You should go," she said, pressing her hand against her shoulder. "You've done enough." Something about that pricked at him, though he wasn't sure why. "They're not here for me. They're here for anything breathing." Her expression shifted, something unreadable flickering across her face. "Then you should leave." Garrick almost laughed. "Not how it works." The hum was getting louder. He swore under his breath, stepping back, scanning the trees. He could run, he should run. He had no stake in this. Let them take her, let them do what they would. That was how it worked. He had learned that the hard way, but then she spoke again. "I can't run." 3 words. Simple, but they hit him harder than they should have. He turned to her, frowning. "What?" She lifted her hand from her wound, and the glow in her skin pulsed brighter for a moment. The blood was still there, but the wound had begun to close. His eyes narrowed. "You heal fast." She shook her head. "Not enough. Not now." Garrick exhaled sharply, glancing at the horizon. The sky had deepened to a darker violet, and the first hints of artificial light flickered between the trees. They would find her, and if they found her, they'd find him. He was already making the choice before he even admitted it to himself. "Come on," he said, grabbing her arm. She flinched but didn't pull away. "Where?" "Somewhere they won't." She hesitated for only a second before nodding. Garrick didn't waste another moment. He pulled her forward, guiding her into the dense foliage, moving fast but careful. The jungle was a maze of towering trees and thick undergrowth, the air thick with damp earth and the distant calls of unseen creatures. He had spent months learning its pathways, its secrets. Now he would use them. She kept up surprisingly well, her movements light despite her wound. He could hear her breathing, steady but strained. "You didn't answer my question," he murmured as they ducked beneath a massive root structure. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "Which one? What are you?" A beat of silence. Then, "My name is Lyara." Garrick didn't know why that made something settle in his chest. He only nodded, pressing forward into the darkness. They moved swiftly through the dense jungle, shadows swallowing their forms as Garrick led Lyara deeper into the unknown. The hum of the raiders' hovercrafts was still distant but growing louder, their searchlights slicing through the darkness like pale blades. Garrick kept his grip firm on her wrist, his mind working through options. They wouldn't be able to outrun them forever. The raiders had tech, sensors, heat scanners. No way to hide out in the open. They needed cover. He veered left, pulling her toward a narrow ravine, the earth dropping sharply beneath them. Lyara stumbled, but he caught her before she could fall, steadying her against him. Her body was warm, that unnatural glow tracing faint patterns over her skin. She looked up at him, those silver eyes reflecting the dim light like liquid metal. "You're leading us somewhere," she said, breathless. "But you haven't decided where yet." Garrick huffed. "Welcome to survival." Her lips pressed together, but she didn't argue. A flicker of movement caught his attention. Just beyond the trees, a break in the landscape. His mind clicked into place. He knew this terrain. A network of old ruins, remnants of an alien civilization long dead. He had avoided them before, unstable, unpredictable, and rumored to house worse things than scavengers. But right now, it was their best shot. "This way," he muttered. They reached the edge of the ravine. Garrick leapt first, landing in a crouch against the loose rock, then turned to her. "Jump." She hesitated only a second before following. He caught her by the arm, stabilizing her before she slipped. Her breath hitched. Whether from the movement or his grip, he wasn't sure. The ruins loomed ahead, jagged spires rising like broken ribs against the dark sky. Garrick kept them low, pressing against the walls as they moved deeper inside. The stone was smooth and cold beneath his fingertips, etched with symbols that pulsed faintly when touched. Lyara's glow responded in kind, her skin's bioluminescence shifting to match the faint light. Garrick frowned. "What the hell is this place?" Lyara exhaled softly. "Sanctuary." He shot her a look. "You know this place?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Not this one, but others like it." Her fingers brushed against the stone. "These places belonged to my people long before they were abandoned." Garrick took that in, scanning the ruins again. The architecture was alien, elegant, unnatural, but not in disrepair. The energy running through it was still active. Something about it made him uneasy. The sound of approaching engines snapped him back into focus. The raiders were closing in. Garrick pulled Lyara further inside, weaving through the maze of corridors until they found an alcove deep within. He pressed her back against the wall, standing in front of her as the distant searchlights flickered through the gaps in the structure. They waited, breath held, as shadows moved outside. Garrick could feel her behind him, her body tense, her breath slow and steady. The moment stretched long, unbearable before the lights passed, the hum of the engines fading again. He let out a quiet breath, stepping back. "We wait here until they move on." Lyara nodded, her gaze flicking over him. "You didn't have to bring me here." He glanced at her, his jaw tightening. "Didn't mean to leave you out there either." Her expression softened. Why? Garrick didn't have an answer. Or maybe he did, but he didn't want to say it aloud. Instead, he sank down against the wall, running a hand through his hair. Lyara sat beside him, studying him for a long moment before she spoke again. "You asked what I was." He didn't look at her, but he was listening. "I was meant to be a protector," she said. "A healer. My people, before the war, we thrived through connection, not conflict. We built sanctuaries like this across the stars." Her voice was quiet, carrying something heavier than just words. "I was supposed to keep my people safe, but I failed." Garrick finally turned to her, studying her expression. There was no self-pity there, just a deep, aching regret. His voice was rough when he finally spoke. "You still think not fighting is the answer?" She looked at him then, her silver eyes unreadable. "I think survival is more than just killing. And I think you do too, even if you don't want to admit it." Garrick held her gaze. Something shifted between them, something unspoken but undeniable. Outside, the storm clouds churned, rolling toward them like an inevitable tide. The storm raged on, roaring against the invisible barrier like a living beast, but inside the ruins, there was nothing but silence and the steady pulse of ancient energy. Garrick had spent years running, surviving by instinct, always looking over his shoulder for the next threat. Now, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't running. Lyara sat beside him, her fingers lightly tracing the glowing etchings on the stone ledge. The patterns pulsed in sync with the gentle glow beneath her skin, the connection between her and this place undeniable. She was a part of it, whether she realized it or not. Garrick studied her in the flickering light. She was still pale from blood loss, but she held herself with quiet strength, her silver eyes sharp even in exhaustion. He had seen plenty of people break under pressure, but Lyara wasn't one of them. "How long will the barrier hold?" he asked, his voice low. She glanced up at him. "If the systems are intact, days, maybe longer," he exhaled, rubbing his jaw. That bought them time. But time for what? The storm would pass, but the raiders wouldn't give up that easily. They had seen something valuable in Lyara. They would come back. He turned his knife between his fingers, his mind already calculating their next move. He was used to thinking ahead, planning for contingencies. But this time, it wasn't just himself he had to think about. "You're planning something," Lyara said softly. He didn't deny it. "That's how you stay alive." She tilted her head slightly, watching him. "You've been alone a long time, haven't you?" The question hit deeper than it should have. He kept his expression neutral. "Better that way." Her lips pressed together in something like understanding. "You think attachment is a weakness?" "It is," he said without hesitation. "You start caring about people, you start making mistakes." Lyara didn't argue. Instead, she looked back at the glowing symbols beneath her fingers. "My people believed the opposite. That connection made us stronger," Garrick scoffed. "Yeah, where are they now?" The moment the words left his mouth, he regretted them. Lyara didn't flinch, but something in her glow dimmed just slightly. She let out a slow breath. "Gone." Garrick clenched his jaw. He wasn't good at this. He didn't do regret, didn't do apologies. But something in the way she sat there so still made his chest tighten. "They were killed?" he asked, quieter this time. She hesitated, then nodded. "Not all of them, but most. Our world fell to raiders much like the ones who hunt us now. I was sent away before the final battle." She exhaled, her voice carrying something old and aching. "I was supposed to return, to rebuild." Her fingers curled slightly against the stone, "but I never made it back." Garrick frowned. "You were exiled," she shook her head. "Saved." A bitter smile touched her lips. "They thought they were protecting me. I thought they were wrong." The quiet stretched between them, filled only by the distant rumble of thunder outside. Garrick had seen plenty of people break under loss. Some people turned soft, seeking comfort in illusions of hope. Others, like him, turned cold. Lyara hadn't done either. She carried her grief differently. She carried it like a promise. "You still think you can rebuild?" he asked after a moment. She turned to him, her silver eyes steady. "I have to." There was no doubt in her voice, no hesitation, just certainty. Garrick wasn't sure why that made something shift inside him. He exhaled, glancing toward the storm still raging beyond the barrier. The world outside was nothing but chaos, death waiting around every corner. But in here, in this forgotten place, there was something else. Something steady. Lyara, he wasn't sure what to do with that thought. "You'll need more than hope to survive," he muttered. She studied him for a long moment. Then, softly, she said, "And you'll need more than survival to live." The words struck deeper than he wanted to admit. He looked away, the weight of her gaze too much. "Get some rest," he muttered. "We leave when the storm clears." Lyara didn't argue. She simply nodded, leaning back against the stone, her glow dimming slightly as exhaustion pulled at her. Garrick remained awake, watching the storm, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing beside him. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone, and that terrified him more than anything. Garrick didn't sleep. Old habits died hard, and he wasn't about to let his guard down, no matter how safe the ruins seemed. He sat with his back against the cold stone, his knife balanced in his hand, absently turning it between his fingers. Lyara had drifted into an uneasy rest, her body curled slightly against the carved stone floor. Even in sleep, she looked poised, her glow faint but still present, flickering softly in time with her breath. It was strange, watching something alive in a way he didn't understand. His gaze traced the golden markings on her skin. They pulsed in slow waves, almost hypnotic. He'd never seen anything like it. He wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the fact that he had nearly killed her, or the fact that he hadn't. She shouldn't be here. She should be dead, another nameless casualty on some forgotten moon. That was the way things worked. He had no reason to spare her, no reason to care what happened next, and yet he clenched his jaw, forcing his focus back to the ruins. The storm outside was beginning to wane, the unnatural lightning fading to distant flickers on the horizon. Soon, the barrier wouldn't be needed and they'd have to move. He should leave her. That was the smart thing, the safe thing. But he already knew he wouldn't. Lyara stirred, shifting slightly before her eyes fluttered open. She blinked, disoriented for a moment, then focused on him. "You didn't sleep," she murmured. "Didn't need to." She pushed herself up, wincing slightly as she touched her shoulder. The wound was nearly gone, only a faint trace of violet blood left against her skin. She studied him for a moment. "You're still planning, always." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "And have you decided?" Garrick exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "We can't stay here." She nodded, glancing at the barrier. "The raiders will come back." "They will," he said, "and when they do, they'll come in force." She met his gaze. "Then we run," he hesitated. "Not this time." Lyara tilted her head slightly, waiting. Garrick wasn't sure why he was saying it out loud. Maybe because part of him wanted to hear the words before committing to them. "We end this," he said, a pause. Then Lyara nodded. She didn't ask if he was sure, didn't question if he meant it, and somehow that made it real. He stood, rolling his shoulders. "We move as soon as the storm clears. If we hit them first, we have a chance." Lyara rose, her expression unreadable. "You've done this before, 100 times. Then you know what it means." He did. It meant putting something on the line. It meant risking more than his own life. He looked at her, and for a brief moment, something passed between them, unspoken, undeniable. He wasn't sure when it had happened. Maybe when she had looked up at him with those silver eyes and asked why he had hurt her. Maybe when she had told him she was meant to protect, even when she had nothing left. But now the choice wasn't just about survival, it was about her. He exhaled sharply. "You ready for this?" Lyara's glow pulsed slightly. "I have to be," he nodded, adjusting his grip on his knife. "Then let's finish it." The storm was dying, and the real fight was about to begin. The storm faded into the horizon, leaving behind an eerie silence. The jungle outside was drenched, steam rising from the ground where the heat of the planet met the rain-soaked earth. The force field surrounding the ruins flickered once, then dissipated completely, its ancient energy spent. Garrick rolled his shoulders, adjusting the strap on his rifle. He had checked his gear twice, his movements mechanical, precise. He'd done this before, prepared for battle, braced for the worst. The plan was simple: strike first, hit hard, and don't stop until there was no one left to chase them. Lyara stood a few steps away, watching the jungle with quiet focus. Her glow was steady now, stronger than before, as if the ruins had given her something back. "You fought before," he said, his voice low. It wasn't a question. She didn't look at him right away. "I was trained to heal," she said finally. "Not to kill." He studied her. "That gonna be a problem?" She exhaled softly. "Violence has already taken too much from me. I won't let it take anything else." That was an answer, though not the one he expected. Garrick glanced toward the jungle, his mind sharpening to the task ahead. "Raiders set up camp about 3 clicks from here. They'll have guards posted, but they won't expect us to come to them." Lyara stepped forward. "Then we use that," he arched a brow. "We," her silver eyes met his. "You're not doing this alone." There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Garrick exhaled, shaking his head. "You don't need to do this." "Neither do you," she countered, but he did. And they both knew it. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "All right, but you listen to me out there. If this goes sideways, we cut and run." Lyara nodded. "Agreed." It was the best compromise he was going to get. Without another word, they moved. The jungle swallowed them whole, the thick canopy casting shifting patterns of shadow and light as they navigated through the damp undergrowth. Garrick led the way, moving with the silent precision of a predator, his eyes scanning for movement, for threats. Lyara followed, her footsteps light, her presence almost ghostly. Minutes stretched into an hour, the tension coiling tighter with each step. Then, movement ahead. Garrick dropped to a crouch, signaling for Lyara to stay low. She mirrored him without question. Through the foliage, the raider camp came into view. A dozen men, maybe more, clustered around makeshift tents and flickering generators. A few modified hoverbikes lined the perimeter, their engines still cooling from the last patrol. Weapons gleamed under the dim light of the portable lamps scattered around the site. Garrick's mind calculated quickly. 2 guards at the entrance, 4 more scattered along the edges. The rest were deeper inside, some gathered around a fire, others checking their gear. It wasn't an army. But it was enough to be a problem. Lyara's fingers brushed against his arm, her voice barely a whisper. "What's the plan?" Garrick's grip tightened around his rifle. "We start with the sentries, quietly." She nodded, her expression calm. He moved first, slipping through the brush like a shadow. The first guard never saw him coming. One swift motion, a blade across the throat, and the body was lowered silently to the ground. Lyara watched, her silver eyes unreadable. The second guard turned at the wrong moment, his mouth parting in alarm. Garrick was on him before he could make a sound, driving his knife deep. He felt the body go limp, then eased it down into the grass, still silent, still unseen. He turned back to Lyara. "You good?" she exhaled, pressing a hand to the ground. The glow in her palm brightened for a second, then faded. "No alarms, they haven't noticed." Garrick nodded. "Then let's make sure they never do." They moved deeper into the camp, the weight of the battle pressing closer, the air thick with the scent of oil, metal, and blood. The fight wasn't over yet, but soon it would be. The next few minutes passed in tense, measured silence. Garrick moved through the raider camp like a phantom, striking fast, never letting them react. Lyara followed, her presence unnervingly quiet, her silver eyes sharp as she took in everything around her. She didn't hesitate, didn't falter. She wasn't a soldier, but she moved like someone who had spent her life surviving. Garrick had expected her to be a liability. Instead, she adapted. The first few kills were clean, silent. A blade to the throat, a precise shot to the skull. One by one, they thinned the numbers without alerting the rest. But there were too many for this to last. Eventually, someone would notice, and then they did. A raider stepped out of a tent just as Garrick was dragging a body into the shadows. The man froze, his eyes widening in shock. Garrick lunged, too late. The raider opened his mouth to shout, but before the sound could leave his lips, Lyara moved. She pressed her palm against his chest, and suddenly the man convulsed, his breath hitching as if something had struck him from within. His limbs went stiff, then slack, his body collapsing to the ground, unconscious. Garrick stared at her. Lyara exhaled, her hand shaking slightly. "It's not permanent," she murmured, "but it will keep him down long enough." He narrowed his eyes. "What the hell did you just do?" she swallowed, flexing her fingers. "I can disrupt bioelectric currents, force a body into temporary stasis." Garrick didn't know what to say to that. He had seen plenty of ways to take someone down. That wasn't one of them, but there wasn't time to process it. The camp had heard something. A distant voice called out, and suddenly, the air shifted, shadows moving, figures emerging from tents, weapons at the ready. They had seconds. Garrick grabbed Lyara's wrist, pulling her back into the shadows of a supply crate just as gunfire cracked through the night. The raiders weren't playing anymore. "We lost the quiet approach," he muttered. Lyara pressed a hand to the ground again, her glow flickering. "I can stall them." Garrick's instinct screamed against trusting something he didn't understand. But there wasn't another choice. Do it. She closed her eyes, inhaling deep. The air around her shimmered, and suddenly, the raiders in front of them staggered. One dropped his weapon, clutching his head. Another blinked rapidly, his body sluggish, uncoordinated. Whatever she was doing, it was working. Garrick didn't waste the opportunity. He surged forward, his rifle kicking against his shoulder as he dropped two raiders in quick succession. A third tried to aim, but Lyara flicked her fingers and the man's body locked up, his muscles refusing to obey him. It was efficient, precise, but it wasn't perfect. A shot rang out from behind them. Garrick barely had time to shove Lyara aside before a bolt of plasma seared through the air, grazing his side. He hit the ground hard, pain lancing through him. Lyara gasped, her eyes going wide as she reached for him. "Garrick, keep moving," he ground out, but she didn't. Instead, she knelt beside him, pressing her hands to the wound. A sharp warmth bloomed against his skin, spreading outward like an electric current. The pain dulled, the raw burn closing faster than it should have. Garrick gritted his teeth. "You shouldn't waste that on me." Lyara's eyes flickered with something fierce. "You're not dying here." For a second, the chaos around them disappeared. The only thing he could feel was her touch, the steady rhythm of her pulse against his skin. Then another shout cut through the night. Reinforcements. Lyara pulled back, her breathing uneven. Garrick shoved himself to his feet, ignoring the lingering burn in his side. "We end this now," he muttered. Lyara nodded. They moved together, their attacks synchronized without needing words. Garrick fired, dropping enemies before they could react. Lyara weaved through the battlefield, her presence like a living storm, disorienting and overwhelming the raiders before they could counter. The fight didn't last much longer. One by one, the raiders fell. The last few tried to flee, disappearing into the jungle. Garrick didn't chase them. Silence settled over the camp. Garrick exhaled sharply, lowering his rifle. His heartbeat was still thudding against his ribs, but they had done it. It was over. He turned to Lyara, who was watching the bodies with something unreadable in her gaze. She had blood on her hands, not her own. "Are you all right?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "I had to make a choice." Garrick understood that better than most. He glanced at the burning wreckage of the camp, then back at her. "So what now?" Lyara looked up at him, her silver eyes reflecting the firelight. "Now we stop running." The fire from the wreckage crackled, embers floating into the thick night air. The jungle, once filled with the chaos of battle, had gone silent. The raiders were gone, dead, scattered, or too afraid to return. It was over, and yet Garrick still felt on edge. His body was still wound tight, muscles coiled, waiting for another fight that wasn't coming. Lyara stood a few steps away, staring at the bodies, her silver eyes unreadable. The soft glow of her skin flickered, uncertain. She had won. They both had. But victory didn't look the way she'd thought it would. Garrick wiped a hand over his face, the adrenaline wearing off, leaving behind only exhaustion. He turned toward her, stepping closer. "It's done." She didn't move. "I know," she murmured, but her voice was distant. He studied her. She wasn't shaking, wasn't crying, but there was something in the way she stood, her posture too still, too controlled. He exhaled. "You never killed before, did you?" Lyara finally looked at him. "No." Garrick nodded slowly. He had nothing to say to that. No words that would make it easier. He had crossed that line years ago, so many times that he had stopped counting. But for her, it was different. She had been trained to heal, not to take lives. And yet she had done what was necessary. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You did what you had to." She let out a slow breath. "Did I?" Garrick didn't answer right away. He could have told her yes, that it had been necessary, that the raiders would have killed them both without a second thought. But that wasn't what she was really asking. She wasn't looking for justification. She was looking for something else, a reason. And Garrick didn't know how to give her that. Instead, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He reached out, resting a hand on her arm. The glow beneath her skin pulsed at his touch, warm and alive. She inhaled sharply but didn't pull away. "You're still you," he said quietly. "No matter what happened here." Lyara's eyes searched his, something raw flickering in her gaze. For a moment it felt like she was trying to see past his words, to something deeper. Then, without warning, she closed the space between them. Her arms wrapped around him, her body pressing into his, and for the first time in years, Garrick didn't flinch from another person's touch. He stiffened for half a second, his instincts telling him to pull away, to put distance between them. But he didn't. Slowly, he exhaled, his muscles loosening as he wrapped his arms around her in return. Lyara buried her face against his chest, her breath warm against his skin. The glow of her body pulsed softly, syncing with the steady rhythm of his heart. Garrick didn't know how long they stood there. The fire crackled. The jungle whispered around them, but nothing else mattered. When Lyara finally pulled back, her silver eyes met his, unguarded. "You were right about one thing," she said softly. Garrick arched a brow. "Only one." A small, tired smile touched her lips. "Survival isn't enough." He stared at her, something shifting in his chest. For years, survival had been all he had, all he had let himself have. But now he wasn't so sure. His fingers brushed against hers, tentative, testing. She didn't pull away. Lyara tilted her head, watching him closely, then closed the last of the distance between them. She kissed him. It wasn't desperate, wasn't rushed. It was slow, deliberate. A choice. Her lips were warm, her glow pulsing with the contact, wrapping around him like starlight. Garrick inhaled sharply, his grip tightening against her waist. He had been in plenty of battles, had faced death more times than he could count. But nothing had ever made him feel as unsteady as this, as wanting. He deepened the kiss, his hands pulling her closer. She melted into him, her breath hitching slightly as his fingers traced over the markings on her skin, her glow responding to his touch. This was different from any fight he had ever known. This was surrender. When they finally broke apart, Lyara exhaled, her forehead resting lightly against his. Garrick swallowed hard, his voice rough. "This changes things." Lyara smiled faintly. "Yes, it does." He let out a breathless chuckle, shaking his head. "You sure about this?" She pulled back just enough to meet his gaze. "I've never been more sure of anything." He studied her, searching for doubt. He didn't find any, so he nodded. And this time, when he kissed her again, he didn't hold anything back. The dawn came slowly, golden light breaking through the thick jungle canopy, casting long shadows over the ruins and the battlefield they had left behind. The scent of damp earth and scorched metal lingered in the air, a reminder of the fight that had nearly cost them everything. But they were alive. Garrick sat at the edge of the ruins, his knife turning absently between his fingers. His body ached, the burn from his wound still faintly there, but it wasn't the pain that kept him awake, it was her. Lyara stood a few feet away, her hands resting on the stone, her silver eyes distant as she looked at the rising sun. The glow in her skin had softened, steady and warm, no longer flickering with hesitation. She looked at peace, or something close to it. Garrick exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face before standing. "You get any sleep?" She glanced over her shoulder, a small smile playing at her lips. "Some." He arched a brow. "Liar." Lyara chuckled softly, shaking her head. "I could ask you the same." He didn't bother denying it. Instead, he stepped closer, standing beside her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was different now. Not empty, not heavy, just there. Finally, Lyara sighed, tracing her fingers over the stone. "It's strange." Garrick tilted his head. "What is?" She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "For the first time in a long time, I don't know what comes next." He studied her, then turned his gaze toward the horizon. He knew what she meant. He had spent so long running, surviving, that he had never stopped to think about what came after, what came when the fight was over. But now, he glanced at her and something settled in his chest. Now he had an answer. "We make a choice," he said simply. Lyara's silver eyes searched his, her glow pulsing slightly. "And what have you chosen?" He exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "I've spent my whole life surviving." He turned to her fully, his voice quieter. "I think I'd like to live." Something flickered in her gaze, something warm, something real. She stepped closer, tilting her head slightly. "And what does that look like?" Garrick hesitated. Not because he didn't know, but because saying it out loud made it real, made her real. His fingers brushed against hers, tentative but sure. "It looks like staying." Lyara inhaled softly, her glow brightening just slightly. "With me?" He met her gaze. "Yeah." She studied him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then slowly she smiled. It wasn't a hesitant smile, wasn't cautious, it was certain. She lifted her hand, resting it against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart. "Then we stay." Garrick let out a slow breath, his grip tightening around her fingers. No running. No looking over his shoulder for the next fight. No empty nights, waiting for something to end him. Just this, just her. Lyara leaned in, her lips brushing against his in a slow, deliberate kiss. Garrick closed his eyes, letting himself fall into her. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his, smiling against his skin. "No more running," she murmured. "No more running." he echoed. The sun rose higher, bathing them in golden light. For the first time in his life, Garrick Vance wasn't afraid of what came next, because now he wasn't facing it alone.